Hello, everyone. My name is Rick Banks. I'm the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, and I am delighted to welcome you to this edition of our periodic series, Tuesday Race Talks. We are honored today to have with us Steve Phillips as our special guest. Steve is the host of Democracy in Color with Steve Phillips. That is a color-conscious podcast on politics. He is also the founder of Democracy in Color, which is a political media organization dedicated to race politics in the multicultural, progressive, new American majority. More about that later. He is the author of the New York Times and Washington Post bestselling Brown is the New White: How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority. Even before his book, Steve was a national political leader. He's also been a civil rights lawyer and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. In 1992, when he was a wee lad, he became the youngest person ever elected to public office in San Francisco, and he went on to serve as the president of the San Francisco Board of Education. He's been very active in political matters. He is the founder of Power Pack Plus, a social justice organization dedicated to building a multiracial political coalition. That organization conducted the largest ever independent voter mobilization effort behind Barack Obama, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris. He has also worked within Democratic Party politics in a variety of ways and has organized grassroots voter efforts and political organizing efforts across our nation. Steve has appeared on multiple national radio and television networks. He's been a fixture at various times on NBC, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all the places you get your news, as well as TV One. He is a columnist for The Nation, and he's a regular contributor to the New York Times. And perhaps especially important for this event, he's a graduate of Stanford University. He attended law school at Hastings College of Law. So that's the formal introduction of Steve. That's his bio. But I want to start with a more personal introduction as well, because I knew Steve actually so long ago that we both had hair. One might even say afros. I knew of Steve, though, before I knew Steve. I actually knew of Steve when I was in high school. My first year of high school as a ninth grader in Cleveland, Ohio. And I can still remember this moment. Our basketball coach was talking about a 10th grader on the team we would play next week. And if this kid was really going to give us trouble. He was tall, he was rangy, he could move, he was smart on the court, he made the right plays, he had a maturity that was rare among 10th grade basketball players. I heard of him already impressed. Not by his political acumen or his intelligence. I didn't know anything about that, but I knew that this kid could ball. And sure enough, when we played them, he did. I imagine now that we won that game. Of course, I'm not really sure, but that's what memory tells me. After undergraduate, Steve and I both came to Stanford. Steve was 1 year ahead of me at Stanford. And I can say during that time that Steve was one of the most politically active members of our community. He was a delegate for Jesse Jackson in 1984, I believe it was. He was a delegate for Jesse Jackson. He was a leader in the Stanford Out of South Africa movement. He took up the mantle of political activism at a time when it was not nearly as popular as it is now, and when the issues to many people did not seem as pressing as they in fact were. But Steve was at the forefront of understanding the need to make political change in the society so that we can have a society that works for everyone. So for those reasons and many others, I'm delighted to be here with Steve for this conversation. So let's start, Steve, if we could go back to that college time, or when we were young adults with hair, and you were thinking about how to move forward, how to navigate the world. Could you give us a bit of your bio from the Stanford days on?
Yeah, well, as you were going, Alan, thank you. I mean, thanks all of you for joining. I'm really delighted to be part of this. I'm glad and thrilled that the center exists and that there's such interest in its work. As you were going through the bios, I'm like, well, it just in length alone reflects the how just how old we are, right? In terms of like, and actually, I remember I was at an event a few years ago, and I saw somebody who I remembered from like when I got on the school board in '92, and then I started Googling him, and I found his LinkedIn, and what I knew him from is so long ago, it's not even on his LinkedIn, actually. So we have that issue. And then it was funny you're talking about the basketball thing. Well, my memory, well, I think we won the game, but by them in that, I don't think of myself as like this, trash talking type person, but distinctly, I don't have a great memory of a lot of that stuff when we were, really young. I remember being at universities, playing away at university school, at the foul line, all the your people booing and whatnot. I made my foul shot. I distinctly remember turning and looking at the audience in a way that my coach wasn't thrilled about. But and then it's funny, Missy, about the bio and the hair and whatnot is that I literally used to have on my bio, Steve's claim to fame is that he went to the same basketball camp as Michael Jordan. And so he was Michael Jordan. I was just like whatever peon. And that in addition to his basketball brilliance, he also made baldness popular. And so there's that we all owe him a great debt of gratitude to. So I don't know, in terms of looking back at I will say that Stanford was very formative. I mean, I think as colleges for a lot of people, it's like you're trying to understand why the world is the way it is. And particularly when you see injustice and inequality and trying to make sense of that. And then what can you actually do about it? And also, as you were, in the bio, and I was thinking back, much of what I did on the school board in San Francisco, it was tied to my work at Stanford. Was the experiences I had at Stanford on trying to diversify the curriculum. So we really tried to move from the Western culture curriculum, which now you're saying, I remember, they sent you this book when you get into Stanford, and then, it was all this fancy stuff in it. But they had this quote says, what is it? Stanford has determined that the study of Western culture is essential to be an educated person, something in that vein. And that happened to be an all white curriculum piece, right? So that was a major thing that we actually went after in terms of making the arguments around the importance of multiracial education, multicultural curriculum. So I had all those arguments when I was on the school board in San Francisco when the curriculum came up there. And so we actually worked to diversify that. And that was like this huge, literally, we were getting calls every 2 minutes from national media. And they were, well, the Examiner, which was a real paper back then, had this headline saying school book list too white. And I was like, well, that's gonna. And then by the end of that week, I was on the Today Show, actually. So in terms of that piece. So, but I think it was really just about trying to understand why the inequalities existed within our society, and that led, and then ultimately, I'm sure, obviously, what can you actually do about it? And so, yeah, my sophomore year, well, on the one hand, it's also the year the Macintosh was invented, but it was also the year Jesse Jackson ran for president, right? And so I had been always drawn to an interest in electoral politics. It's like, I think that the way people are drawn to music or something. I've always loved electoral politics. And I came out of a, fairly religious tradition. My grandfather was a minister in Cleveland, Ohio. And so, and I was always very interested in the civil rights movement, right? As a child, I read all the books on Martin Luther King in the elementary school library. And so my first memories was like a 3-year-old, my dad taking me to see Martin Luther King in Cleveland. So all that kind of came together for me in the Jackson's '84 campaign. Connection to the civil rights movement, a lot of religious metaphor and language, and electoral politics trying to get at the inequalities in society. So that was a very formative experience for me. And in my book, Brown is the New White, I dedicated to different family members, and I dedicated to Jesse Jackson, and who showed the world what's possible in terms of a campaign focused on racial justice. And I said I was paying attention, right? So that was a very determinative. A lot of people don't fully appreciate that in many ways, the path that was blazed by Jackson made Obama possible in terms of everything from, the actual coalition, the different activists, people like Maxine Waters, Barbara Lee came out of that campaign, as well as some of the changes that he made in terms of democratizing the nomination process. So I think it was kind of all of those things together, and then actually I had forgot about this for decades, but we had a meeting with some of the other activist friends from what were we going to focus on as activists to try to build more of a movement, and we settled on education. So the people are here for education. I guess something that really resonates with them, and that's partly how we wound up taking on the whole issue of the Western culture battle. So that whole curriculum piece was a formative experience. And so if I look at these things in retrospect, like what were the major pieces? And then you had the Free South Africa movement. And so in 84 and 85, you had all these images of people in the streets marching, demanding democracy. And then that just, you feeling a sense of like, what's my responsibility and my connection and obligation to that? And that led to some of the activism around with other students in this, in the country at Berkeley, Columbia, around getting Stanford involved in that effort. So those were, I think, some of the major formative experiences. And I do feel like there's kind of the combination of the academic study around some of the inequality, but then also the activism work where I learned about some of the tools of social change. And those experiences, I should say, is what has really stood me in relatively good stead ever since.
Did you think much about it? It occurred to me earlier today when I was thinking about this, that, while you were very focused on political activism, I frankly was not so drawn to political activism, but was more focused on direct services, you might say. So I remember when Stanford out of South Africa became a big thing, I and Daniel, Daniel Coles and some other students, we actually started a tutoring program in Ravenswood, right? And we were very focused on that kind of direct action work, and actually weren't that engaged with the political work. Did you ever think about that divide between sort of direct action, kind of, helping people in that here and now sense versus broader change in structures that can lead to, long-term change? Did you ever think about that divide?
Yeah, well, I was, when you're young, you're so pure as well, right? And so I remember we were doing these rallies on White Plaza, and then people would be riding by on their bikes going wherever. And I literally could not comprehend, where are you going? There's nothing more important than actually being here at this moment around this struggle of this, right? So you have that piece. And then in that sense of purity, I should go actually back and find it. To this day, I remember you wrote a column in the paper, which was some more nuanced take on a very black and white issue that we were fighting. We were all like, he's a sellout. He's over there doing this other, he's not with the party line and whatnot. But I think that
you're really outing me now. I was trying to keep some stuff hidden, but I think what you're referring to, this highlights the issue, is that there was a sense, or I had a sense that while there are these big problems in South Africa, right, that people want to focus on, we also have problems really close to home. We don't, and even now it's apparent, we don't need to go far. If you're concerned about homelessness, you don't need to try to solve that worldwide. You can try to solve that right in Palo Alto even. And that was a challenge. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I was never very drawn to, and I think it was more somewhat later that I began to see the continuum in terms of people responding to the issues of the conditions that they see in terms of people being poor, not having and then what can you do about it? And then some people getting involved more through direct service, and then in that context, seeing some of the larger structural problems that demand more political action. Um, I don't know. I mean, if you were to like talk to my therapist or whatever, they would probably, in terms of like wanting to be part of grand things, there's
Yep.
probably some element of that as well, right? That had me gravitate towards political action, Jesse Jackson. I mean, one of the things that Jesse really did that even I find myself um, continuing to do now is to draw these connections. And so you want what you're doing to be meaningful, and it can be meaningful in the context of being part of this continuum.
Mhm.
And so to actually feel like, yes, everyone says Dr. Martin Luther King, et cetera, but what's the modern day manifestation of that? And then are you connected to people who were part of that? And so, obviously Jesse provided that, Clay with the King Papers project. And so I think I was more drawn to those different elements pretty quick, because partly because I was always interested in electoral politics as part of it, but it was also the activism, but it did continue to cascade. And so we did a lot of work around um, access to education, lack of diversity in terms of who the student population is, and then you start to feel like, see, well, where are starting at a place like Stanford, then where are the problems in that? Then you start to get at K-12 education system, and that is not the pipeline, and the conditions there actually have to be addressed. And that was part of the influence for me to go to work on the San Francisco public schools, to start to tie that thread together.
Let me tell you, so we're going to roll this forward, but let's pause just for a minute at your law school experience. So you went to law school a few years after undergrad. That time, and you worked as a civil rights lawyer, and even one point you had an office in East Palo Alto, I believe, right? And so you were a civil rights lawyer, you went to law school. How did law school figure in your trajectory and in your figuring out what to do? And we have law students, obviously, listening who are trying to answer some of these questions for themselves. Is how does law school figure into who I want to be professionally in the world?
So I think two or three different aspects of it for me. When I applied to college, I think I put lawyer, and I was always very interested in law, right? And so what's the thing? I don't even know what the modern popular culture manifestation would be, but there were these different generational popular cultural influences that sent people in the law, right? So there's Perry Mason, right, which is really dating yourself, which I was drawn to. There's LA law, then there was the practice, right, in terms of the the 80s and the 90s and whatnot. So I put pre-law in my college application, in terms of there was always something that I think that was in my mind, probably somewhat tied to the politics piece. I put a lot of that aside just to do the activism and the organizing and the intensity and the urgency of the moment. Um, and so, but it was always there. And then I went to San Francisco after undergrad and got involved in politics, and ran for in one office to the school board. And so there are a couple of different parts to it. So one, I'll come back to the school board thing in a second, is that as a Black man in America, I understood the importance of credentials, and I wanted the credential. And I tend to, when I graduated from law school, I don't even know whose idea this was. We wound up having a karaoke party at at this restaurant bar, and people were kind of shocked, just kind of like see me up there and whatnot. And then I remember I was all like, they can't take this away from me, right? Is that I now have this law degree. And so that was a very intentional part of my decision to go to law school. Um, and then, frankly, a part of it was I went when I was on the school board. And so one of the things that I never forget that we had this meeting. It was the school board and the community college board together with our lawyer around a lawsuit that we were facing. We had passed a sales tax to raise money for the schools. Things are probably around up, say it was around $100 million. And it wouldn't have been that large. And we had this meeting with the lawyer by phone, but the lawyer was out of town.
Mhm.
And so, and then we were facing this lawsuit, and some people had sued, and they'd actually tried to get their money back from the sales tax. And what they had wanted was like, if it were 100 million, say it was like 1 million or whatever, right? And so it was on that scale of what was at risk in terms of what we actually had. And they sent us to another lawyer who was in the firm, but didn't know anything about the case. And his advice was, oh, don't do anything. Just don't do anything because we don't have the other guy. And so we had 14 elected officials paralyzed, unable to take advantage of this measure that we had actually passed because this single lawyer told us we couldn't actually do anything. And I distinctly remember that to this day. And I feel I want to be like, I don't want to be disempowered like that. I want to be able, I don't want someone to tell me, oh no, you can't do that, it's against the law. I want to be like, show me the law. Show me the, the cases interpreting it, right? So we can look, I'm not hamstrung. So it was an empowerment piece in terms of the context of my elected work. But it's funny now, in terms of tying all the way back to the direct service piece, it was actually very satisfying, however many years later, to help specific individuals. And so there was something about that. I mean, I really kind of enjoyed learning the tools and the techniques of how do you walk into a courtroom to be able to access this institution and leverage and fight in there for somebody who's been disempowered. But it's also very meaningful in a way that probably is people get from direct service to be able to like, this particular person lost their job and I can help them get some level of, redress or balance in their situation. So I found that very satisfying in terms of practicing law as well.
Okay. And how did you, and after this was in the 90s, the school board time and the law school time. So now we're going to roll the clock forward. You were very active in Barack Obama's campaign from the very early stages. And then you've been very active, we should mention too, with Stacey Abrams and voter education, voter registration campaigns in Georgia in particular. Can you talk about some of your political activism and how those interventions came about?
Yeah, no, well, it's funny because I remember a friend of mine, Pierre Barolette, who's married to Stacey Layton, who was a Stanford Law grad. Actually, this is a whole other story, diversion, but if we're talking on law. So Stacey was undergrad with me, activist back in the day. And she went out going to Stanford Law School. She went on to a distinguished career. She was first in her class at Stanford Law, clerked for Justice Breyer, was a partner at a firm. But she, I think a couple of years ahead of her, found out she was first in her class at Stanford the day I found out I passed the bar. And that we separately, at the same time, decided to go to the same restaurant to celebrate. And so we ran into them, La Traviata in San Francisco. And so we have dinner, let's have dinner together. I think I remember toasting her. I said, Stace, you don't have to be first in your class to pass the bar, right? So
that's a good lesson. That's a good lesson for people too. You need to pass the bar.
Yes, very much so.
That's the bar. But anyway.
So in terms of so it was Pierre who said to me in 2005 that he says, oh, hey, Ron, he says, you should, this is after the Obama was first elected, and he had given the convention speech. Pierre's like, you should get together, you should get behind this Obama guy. I think he's going places. This is 2005. And I'm all like, I got other things to do, priorities and whatnot. But, I know what it was, is that we have been doing we created Power Pack in 2003 as a way of trying to increase civic engagement. That ties back to the rainbow work. As I saw the power of bringing the movement, the energy of the movement into the electoral sphere, and what that could actually do about bringing political changes. I mean, it's kind of lost to history now. Jesse went from, we all feared he's going to make a total, embarrassment his first run. He did well, 400 delegates, 3.5 million votes. 4 years later, 1,200 delegates, 700 votes, leading the race after a certain point. So I saw what was possible in terms of bringing that movement energy into the political sphere, but there weren't very many organizations doing that in California. And so we very consciously tried to build something. And we actually did a statewide tour with Reverend Jackson in 03, 04 around one of these ballot measures. And I saw the same energy in response to a hunger for social justice politics in California. And so that's what led us to create Power Pack and to do work in California, look at the changing demographics, Inland Empire, Orange County, San Diego, all majority people of color counties, which did not have that kind of politics though. And so we tried to actually work with community groups, expand voter participation in those areas. So that's like 03, 04 in California. So then in 05 and then 06, it was 06, late 06 when Obama said he was going to run. And California said it was going to move its primary up into to make it more relevant. We've done all this work in California. So that's when we said, okay, well, let's then get into trying to be helpful. Life is so funny. You look back at it. We had a meeting. Oh, I didn't even thought about this. So we had this meeting January 2007. It was a lunch meeting. Ben Jealous, Maya Harris, Ben's then wife Leah, and myself. And we were all saying, if we all put our networks together, we could make a difference. Should we get behind the then head of the NAACP, or should we get behind this Obama guy? And we got behind Obama. Maya Harris is now the sister of the Vice President of the United States, Stanford law grad, Maya is. Ben went on to be president of the NAACP. So it's just kind of funny how like where life actually takes you in that regard. So, but we thought the way to do it was to create a independent entity. And so we actually, law students, went to our lawyers and we're like, what's possible in terms of organizing major donors to get involved in a political election campaign? And we had our lawyers draw up these, look at the federal election rules and lead us. And so we actually created in 2007, the country's first super PAC, which is called—
that was the first super PAC in the country.
It's called Vote Hope. So previously had the 527 organization, which is the code of the Internal Revenue Code, but they changed the laws after 04. And so the super PAC became the vehicle. And then we spent 2 days on the phone with the Boston Globe trying to write that this was illegal. And then we got our lawyer to see what it was, and they wound up writing an article. Oh, it's a innovative new effort and whatnot. And so we created the vehicle, and we were the only, because we were first, we were the only entity that was actually out there. And so when people wanted to move real money, there was a guy, John New, out of New York, who was looking around. He wanted to give $1 million to help Obama. Mm-hmm. And we had created the vehicle. And so he's like, oh, where's that thing that they're doing? So he actually gave us $1 million. Somebody else who worked at Google at the time came in to give us $1 million to put that whole piece together. And so, but because we were the only thing that was out there, and it was actually all very controversial, to a certain extent. And we had, and the San Francisco Chronicle did like hit piece on us, summer of 07, and it was on the front page. But it happened to run the day after Barry Bonds broke the home run record. So the paper put a special cover on top of the piece. So it totally buried their hit piece on us. But they had gotten Obama to try to distance himself from us and whatnot. But we were the primary vehicle for, if you have more than the $2,000 that you could max out to the campaign, there was nowhere else to go. And so people came to us. And we put together independent expenditure effort, increased turning out Black voters in Georgia, Alabama, Maryland, Virginia. I hadn't even to this second put that piece together. So my work in Georgia goes back actually to 08. Yep. We met Stacey Abrams in 2012, actually.
And what lessons are you drawing from the developments in Georgia? I mean, this is a state that I personally would not have expected to turn blue in any meaningful sense. So we've seen changes there that perhaps were unexpected, at least from 20 years ago. What are the lessons you draw from that?
Yeah, so it really goes back to the Rainbow Coalition days. And so Jesse used to talk about when the old minorities come together, they comprise a new majority. And so I like to say that I've been building the small R rainbow ever since the 80s. And so you could see it. That's what I was saying about Jesse's success. Jesse won the Georgia primary in 2008. So you could see the power and the potential, even if it wasn't fully manifested yet. So I could see it from that standpoint. Then in 2008, Obama came with within 200,000 votes, 5% within Georgia, without even trying, without contesting it. And that was the other thing that Jesse had also talked about. He had this, he's a lot of the biblical metaphor of David versus Goliath, and all of these eligible, unregistered, non-voting people of color. He called them rocks just lying around that David could use to go up against Goliath. And this whole thing about rocks just lying around. So I always saw the math around if you expand the voter universe that you could actually impact and win elections. And so that was always very clear. So I had that understanding. And so then when I met Stacey Abrams, Ben Jealous connected me to say, he's known Stacey for 25 years. Stacey had a plan. I met Stacey Abrams in 2012, and she had this 26-page multi-year plan for how they were going to steadily increase voter turnout in Georgia to pick up seats in the legislature and ultimately turn Georgia blue and flip it. And it was all very empirical and mathematical. So she wrote a recent piece, people should find that, very recent, New York Times, Stacey and Lauren Grow-Argo, about the lessons. She talks about it may take 10 years, but you should do it and keep going. So she stayed with it. So she did the math, stayed with it, and showed that increasing voter turnout of people of color is a cornerstone of making major political change. And that's why I wrote my book, was that it all seemed very obvious to me, from my connection to the civil rights movement, and then seeing Jesse building on the civil rights movement and how well he had actually done, and then Obama running and winning. It was like all a continuum. And you had all these people, mainly white consultants, who were like discounting all of it. Like, oh, well, it was a once in a lifetime experience. He was so super gifted and you never replicate that. And I was like, no, this is the composition. Obama would not have beaten Reagan because the country wasn't diverse enough. So that's what led me to write my book, which I don't think you even know this, came out in 2016 instead of 2014 because of you. And so you are on the mute there.
I was assuming that. I just didn't know if that was true.
I was alarmed that people had the wrong lessons about the implications of Obama's election, that they weren't going to try to build on that coalition. They're going to try to keep going back to the futile effort to get white swing voters. And if we have to continue to invest in and expand voters of color, that's the lesson of the Obama experience. And so that was what led me to write this book, to try to get it out there in the world before 2016. Well, really in 2014 was my initial goal. And then as naive as I was, like, oh, I'm gonna put this together in a couple months and then I'll get stuck there. I know all this stuff. How
books take longer than that. But let me pause you here, because this is a key point, though. So your argument in your first book, Brown,
is the new one.
In your first book, your argument is that the common sense wisdom, the conventional view that the Democratic Party needs to tack to the center to appeal to the folks in the middle, your view is that that's wrong. Why is that wrong?
Because it's not what the math and the numbers show. In that if you understand Obama's election, the way he won was by expanding the electorate, bringing new people in, swelling the numbers of people, making it's just back to the Jesse thing about these rocks lying around, bringing more people into the process, more younger people of color. And he proved it, 2008, and then multiply 2012, which is kind of lost to history as well. He got 5 million fewer white votes in 2012 than he got in 2008. The excitement had worn off from some of these folks, and he still won. And he did that by expanding turnout. And so that's what the math had shown. And all these efforts to trying to be Republican light or, basically pander to a lot of the worst instincts of people who are afraid of the growth of people of color. They simply haven't worked. You very few places you can point to so yeah, that worked over there. So that was a lot of what that was the underlying point. It was trying to demonstrate that Obama's election proved that there is a new American majority that's quantifiable. 75 to 80% of people of color, 39% of whites. That's the majority of the US population. That's the majority of the eligible voters. And that was the essence of the Obama coalition. If you could replicate that, you could actually win elections. So trying to make that argument and get that out there so people would impact the 2014 elections. And you and I had a phone conversation, and you have the perspective and the pacing of a professor where I was like, we got to get this going. And I was like, I want to get this out because I want to influence the election. And you said, there'll be another one, right? And I was all like, oh, that's true. There will be another election. So that's actually what gave me the peace to say, you know what, I'm going to take my time and try to write this as good as I can. So, but that was the whole point of that. And we tried to make that argument. And then I think so that's probably why I resonated with Stacey, is that she had the same analysis and she had a plan and a commitment to build upon that and to make that happen. Still, again, without the support of the mainstream part, Joe Biden did not invest anything in Georgia. Yet Stacey went and won that state for him, basically. He said election night, Georgia, that wasn't part of the plan, but it was always part of Stacey's plan. So that I think is kind of where we're at, is that and then it continues apace. The country continues to become more and more diverse. And there is what I call meaningful minority of whites who consistently vote more progressive. Mm-hmm. And that's a majority. If we will focus in on nurturing that, investing in it. I helped Stacey raise $54,000 in 2012. I got her 10,000 of that 54,000. This past year, she raised $90 million. Wow. And flipped Georgia and flipped the Senate. Wow. And is going to move $2 trillion into the country because of that proper investment. So that to me is the lesson around where we're at and where we need to
this is amazing. Let me highlight just one lesson there, because it's not only extraordinary what she did in Georgia and then the results and the implications for the nation, but also that she was working on this for a decade before it bore fruit in a way that the rest of us could see, right? She was laboring in, it's fair to say, obscurity. But she had a vision, she had a plan, she stuck to that plan. And, most people only got on board with that plan and saw the brilliance of it once it began to bear fruit. But she believed in it, presumably all along. And
it was very data driven. Yep. And the very first email she sent me, which people you can search my tweets to find, is I actually tweeted out a screenshot of it on the night Warnock and Ossoff won in January. She said, we have real opportunities here in Georgia, but it will require careful planning and friends from around the country. And so she's been carefully planning ever since and building methodically in that direction. And so I had screenshotted that email, which came January 2011, that she, in terms of, introducing herself and us getting to actually meet. And so I screenshot to put it on Facebook, and then Makima Williams is now in Congress and is another person in Stacey's orbit. She tweeted it out, and then Stacey retweeted it. And Stacey says, says something very, laudatory and appreciative of her, our partnership over these years. And my Twitter followers doubled overnight.
That will happen. Yeah. That will happen. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Let me ask you one question though about these changing demographics. How confident should we be that the growing Latinx and Asian American populations will vote in the progressive fashion that many of the demographic projections predict?
It's not a given by any standpoint, which is what part of the urgency of the situation is. And I remember when I was working on that book the first time, I was like, why are Republicans so racist? If they were less racist, they could actually do much better in terms of the significant part of the electorate, but they've so doubled down on the white nationalist strategy that it repels all these different people. But you start to see a little bit of it this past year, and I don't think it was in terms of people keep saying, "Oh, well, Trump made some inroads among a little bit among African Americans, some among Latinos." I think if we drill down on that for real, what you'll really see is that he made inroads among some Latino men and some African American men, and that the machismo resonated with some sector of those people, and we discount the power of sexism within our national politics, completely discount in terms of what happened in 2016. So you have that, and then I really worry about, and this will be interesting to see what happens in 2024, someone like Marco Rubio, right, who can culturally connect with the Latino experience in ways that could resonate. And if we have not done the work, because Democrats have been ambivalent all along about, we don't want to be too allied with people of color, because then you're going to lose those white supporters who you think that you're going to be able to get, but you're not. So that's ambivalence does not create the kind of loyalty and enthusiasm that's going to be necessary. So it's a very precarious moment that we're actually in terms of solidifying and being able to deliver for those communities. But one thing that's left out of the Georgia story is that the Latinos and Asians went heavily Democratic. And that's partly because of the investments and the work that Stacey's been doing all these different years. But it's by no means a given. And it's going to be fascinating to see on the Republican side which route they go. Because this is the other thing people keep saying is that Trump did lose a lot of support relatively in terms of white moderates, white suburban women. So he did. That's, in fact, I think everyone agrees that that's the case. And he got 10 million more votes. So that means he found 12 to 14 million previously infrequent voting people who resonate with this cultural panic, as the demographic panic, as Joy Reid refers to it as. So it all kind of hangs in the balance, but the majority is slightly on our side and increasingly on our side given the population changes. The population gets more and more diverse as we go, but Democrats have been very reluctant to commit. And we saw the thing about Stacey. I'm saying the Biden made no investment in Georgia. Our group, Democracy in Color, did a report card on the super PACs in 2020. The Senate super PAC, as of August 1st last year, had spent $7 million in Iowa, 90% white Iowa with the white candidate there, $0 in Georgia. 7 million in Iowa, 0 in Georgia, which is the mindset. And so if that's your approach, you're not building infrastructure, you're not building loyalty, you're not embracing and making a commitment to the communities who are in fact going to be the new American majority, because they're fearful that they're going to lose some white support. But that fear is going to keep them from getting the depth of support, which will keep people of color aligned with them. So that's the moment that we're in. And that really, I think, what a lot of the 2020s is going to be about politically.
Yeah, and these are some of the issues that your new book, which is still in process, is going to speak to. I hope I can reveal that it's tentatively titled "How We Win" or "How Do We Win the Civil War?" Yeah. But it's not really historical. It's focused on the present. So tell us about this project. How do we win the Civil War? What's the Civil War and how do we win it?
Well, it's not historical, but it is historical, because the fundamental premise is that the South and the Confederates never surrendered. And that and then this is what's so fascinating to me, is that how little in our popular consciousness, everybody knows Abraham Lincoln and this and that, and Lincoln was killed. I didn't even really know until I started researching this, that Lincoln was killed 5 days after the supposed surrender in the Civil War by Confederate sympathizers. That's not surrender to go and murder the president of the United States. And so they have been fighting and resisting and continuing literally since 1865, up until January 6th, people with Confederate flags stormed the United States Capitol. So, but there's which is we're seeing now in terms of how much they're going to go out, how much we're going to hold them accountable, et cetera. There's been a reluctance to admit the type of struggle that we're in, and to make the commitment to actually embrace people of color, hold accountable the Confederates, to put in place the types of things that will actually build power. Because now you're seeing a lot of Republicans like, oh, you said you want to have unity, et cetera, after, you know, all this time of trying to consolidate their power. So the first,
So let's pause here. So what is it? I want to break this up into chunks because there's so much material here. What is it that people misunderstand or don't understand about the nature of the struggle or the problems or the challenges that we confront now?
they do not understand that our opponents are waging war against us.
Mhm.
And so that leads you to more of an accommodationist, compromise. And this thing about like law, I remember when I was in law school and we were studying like two different Supreme Court cases around whatever it was. And I remember the professor saying, well, how do you reconcile the court's decision in this case with the court's decision in that case? And I was like, it's a different court. That's how I reconcile it, right? It's like there's this notion that there's this continuous body that has logical internal coherence, whereas it's really all just a big power struggle.
Right.
How do you
It could have just been that Marshall was replaced by Thomas.
exactly
That explained it.
right? And so we don't appreciate there's this sense of we should have compromise, and this is how the government should work, and we don't want to be too, you know, forceful. We want them to all be with us together. We're not dealing with people who are operating in good faith. So that premise around, and so if you can't have a situation where the head of the Senate denies his constitutional responsibility to have a hearing and a vote for the president of the United States Supreme Court nominee because it's an election year. And then when it's your president, you ram through Supreme Court. Those aren't people of good faith. And so that's the first understanding, is that we're not trying to find some compromise that'll work for everybody. They don't want it to work for us because they are trying to suppress, oppress, marginalize our people. And so unless we have that mindset and understanding, we're not going to function properly. This is what we've seen with the Voting Rights Act. People literally died for the Voting Rights Act. We finally get it passed. But there's all this resistance from the South, and then this eagerness to relax it and get away from it. And then what happens? A whole slew of additional suppression measures come. And so we have to build power, and we have to function as if we are under attack, because we are under attack, and pass policies that expand power. Like one of the lawyer mentors of mine, Tony Tanky, was saying when I was practicing law, says he always could figure out what was the right thing to do in litigation by looking at what the opposing counsel was doing and doing the opposite, right? In terms of and he said that always stood him in good stand in terms of conducting litigation. So if they're off trying to suppress the vote, we should be trying to expand the vote. And so there's things like that we're not actually necessarily operating on. So that's my fundamental analysis in the book, is that I show the continuity of this Confederate effort to entrench white nationalism within the country from 1865 to today, the first third of the book. And then I look at how we win, which is case studies from Georgia, Virginia, Arizona, Texas, and San Diego, around places.
Hold on. So before we get to the what to do stuff, let me give another question or two about the diagnosis of the problem. Is the white nationalism problem, is that something that's always been there, or has it been resurgent lately?
It's always been there. It's always been there. And it's so fascinating because like we, hold ourselves out to be educated people. We both went to elite private high schools, and then to Stanford, and then to law school. And you start to realize so much you still don't know, right? You were talking about in terms of Dr. King, things we didn't actually know about him and whatnot. So in 1948, Truman wanted to desegregate the military and do some other, what I think we would feel, very modest civil rights steps. The Confederates and the Southerners were so mad, they were like, no, we're going to form a third party and run against the president to defeat you. And so this is whole Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrats, was a reaction to an attempt to hold on to their power, right? So that famous picture with Truman, with Dewey defeats Truman. The reason the newspapers thought that Dewey was going to defeat Truman is because the Dixiecrats were splitting the vote. And so that's like a whole law. So you have that. Then you go up to the George Wallace, the 1960s. I part of my book, I'm talking about, there was a guy in 1964 in Georgia who passed runoff elections, who drove to work to pass runoff elections, specifically to prevent Black people from being able to influence what happens then. The reason we had a runoff election on January 6th is because they passed this law back in 1964. And there's like quotes from them saying, yeah, we wanted to dilute the vote. And that is what happened. Warnock got the most votes in November in that runoff, but they made him go to a runoff in the original election in November. They made him go to a runoff because that's where they didn't want to be a consolidated Black vote and a split white vote. If that happened, then they wanted white vote to coalesce again. And so
and you're saying the origins of that rule was a desire to suppress the Black vote and Black political power.
Quite explicitly.
Yes.
In the 1960s, 1964. And so and then back to our ages, right? That's when we were born, is in that whole time. So it's in our lifetime that these different things have actually come. And then you have the Southern strategy, which people talk about. So Strom Thurmond, who ran as a Dixiecrat, didn't back George Wallace, who was much more of his ilk, backed Richard Nixon because he wanted to build power and entrench more of the Confederate type people within office, succeeded in that. And then you had Ronald Reagan, who then actively worked to undermine the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights pieces. And so you have this continuity, which is why people are missing the moment. He keeps saying about like, oh, Trump's influence on the party and it's all about Trump and it's a cult. Yes, but it's not about Trump. It's about the underlying sentiments of white nationalism, this being a white country, have propelled political leaders forward for the entire history of this country.
Wow. So how do we, in white nationalism, I mean, this just seems like obviously not a desirable culture, political culture for our nation. So how do we vanquish white nationalism in our politics, at least?
One of these guys with the insurrectionists literally has a card that says a white privilege card. And it's like the number is like 45, 45, 45, referencing, Trump being the president. So the way to do it is what they're doing in Georgia is building political power. This is the core argument, and I think our greatest hope. The Obama coalition, what I call the New American Majority, is the majority. And so if we need to protect and expand and invest in that. And so when we do this, what we're living in right now, when we do that, we are able to oust not just the white nationalists, but the incompetent white nationalists from the White House, so we can get in a president and an administration which actually wants to solve a once in 100-year global pandemic and is moving towards actually doing that. We can get back into the climate accord. We can start to move $2 trillion to people who are suffering so that everybody's lives are actually improved. But you need the political power to be able to do all those different types of things.
So Steve, though, so are you suggesting, though, that we should focus less on trying to change the hearts and minds of those who are sympathetic to white nationalism and more instead on simply disempowering them? Is that the strategy?
Absolutely. There's no evidence that you can change their hearts and minds.
Okay.
And so there's a great column by Connie Schultz, who's the columnist in Ohio.
I think she's a columnist in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah.
That's our hometown. All good things from Cleveland. That's right.
Right. And then she's, married to Sherrod Brown. So she wrote this column during the Obama years. She's in a cab with this white cab driver who's attacking Obama, and nothing good has come out of Obama. And so she's trying to find common ground, right? She's from like the west side of town, the white suburbs, et cetera. And he's just totally attacking Obama. hates Obamacare. And then towards the end of the article, he finds out that his wife, I think it was, had cancer or some kind of, she needed significant health care and was getting health care from Obamacare. And then she's all like, well, what's up with that?
Right.
And he's like, okay, there's some stuff that he could do. And then there's this book, Dying of Whiteness.
Oh, but so his mind did change then.
Not about, well, he conceded that's one good thing had come out of Obama's administration. He didn't switch to supporting Obama.
Right.
Right. And so that's that book, Dying of Whiteness, right? Where you have this guy literally dying, needing health care, and refusing to get health care because it came from Barack Obama, illegal immigrants, etc., and literally just died.
Right.
You're not going to change these people's minds,
Right.
but you can change their lives, like with this cab driver,
right.
in terms of actually providing health care, which is for everybody, including them. That's far more effective and likely than trying to change them. I mean, that's the part of the New York Times, the 1619 Project. We've been up against this mindset for a long, long time.
Let me give you one more take on that. So one idea of, I mean, sort of educational efforts might not be enough, but building on your observation about changing people's lives, one view might be that white people who are sympathetic to white nationalism, they're invested in it in part because it gives them something, even when economically the system is not working for them, right? So their lives are not that great, but at least they're white, and that's something, and they want to cling to that, right? And then one response to that would be that, if you can improve their lives, perhaps that will encourage them, that will diminish their desire or their need to cling to white nationalism and that kind of racial identity. And it will also allow them to maybe see how race has been used historically and perhaps today to keep working people apart from each other, so that they can't organize and they can't create a society that works more for all people. So is it naive then to imagine that we can have Black people, white people, Asian people, Latino people recognize that race has been used and manipulated across time to allow some people to stay rich and most people to stay disempowered, and that in fact, the working class white people who might sympathize with white nationalism, they actually have a lot in common, or should recognize they have a lot in common with the Black people who are also not doing well. Is that a naive hope or not, that people through society changing will come to recognize that they'd all be better off if they can work together?
At the margins, there's potential for that. And so that's what I'm actually working on a piece now for The Nation on Ohio Senate election, and looking at these two different roads. So we try to expand the Obama coalition, we try to change the minds of the Trump voters. And Democrats have never, certainly at the presidential level, never won the majority of the white vote since Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, ever. Southern drawl Jimmy Carter didn't win the majority of the white vote. Southern drawl Bill Clinton didn't win a majority of the white vote. So the notion that you're going to get a majority, there's just absolutely zero empirical evidence you're going to get a majority. Now you can expand, right? So even looking at Ohio, right? So Obama got 41% of whites, Biden 39,
Mm-hmm.
Hillary got like 26%, right? So there's something there to get from those, bottom line levels to get higher. So it's worth in that space trying to attract some of those people. But it's like within businesses, you don't focus on, what is the number? White working class used to be 75% of all voters in the 70s. It's now like 42, 43%. And there's like this graph that shows us. And so you don't invest in shrinking, you don't overly invest in shrinking markets. You invest in growing markets. And so what's growing is young people, majority of young people, I think under 15, I know under 10, are people of color. They have a different world view instead of priorities. And how much are we building their allegiance? And it's a question of allocation of time, energy, and resources, right? So I was getting into it. I'm too small a figure to get into it, but I was critiquing Nate Cohn from the New York Times today. They're still on this whole thing of like trying to trash efforts around voter mobilization as a strategy. And I was like, that's not how Democrats spend their money. 90% of their money is still spent on TV ads trying to go after these people in the middle and change their minds. So I just don't think that there's a allocation of time, energy, and effort. You can make the argument, try to win some of these people over, but if you're trying to win elections, you've got to get the people who are going to be with you, and then you can have these mind-changing conversations.
Okay, so your prescription in the book is going to be enlarge the electorate, political activism. We need to empower the voters who we are likely to think already see the progressive agenda as an agenda that's going to work for them and that they're allied with. And
absolutely, and that's what the lessons. That is what the evidence shows.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Virginia, Arizona, Georgia, all have gone Democrat, all over 10 years of steady, sustained investment in expanding the participation of people of color. And that's the only empirical evidence we have of what actually works.
Okay. So, and then once this political activism is effective, and we see evidence that it has been effective already, what are the sort of policies that you think are the key levers or hold the key levers to producing positive change and creating a society that works better for everyone?
Well, that's the chapter I'm getting to. Hell, I haven't done my full draft.
We can talk through it now. Is that so? So you get the political power. What do you do with it?
So I would say there's maybe two phases to it. So the first phase is this question around what were we fighting for in the first place? Mm-hmm. And so racial justice, economic justice, democracy. Mm-hmm. That's really what the Civil War was about. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment really get to those different pieces. So, and what happened last year after George Floyd was killed, right? The awareness can focus on, for at least a month, on systemic racism and the continued structural inequality within our society, where the resources go, who makes these different decisions in all these different sectors, from a university to, Hollywood to any other place. So racial justice is core in there. Economic justice is still extremely stratified society, which is, kind of back to the, Occupy Wall Street, 99%, 1%, all of that is very true. And then democracy is how they try to suppress all of this, right? And it's 160 bills have been introduced since the start of the year to try to suppress the vote in these different key states. So that's part of their playbook from 1865. So that's the core piece. But then there's a whole other thing, which is I'm trying to start to think through more broadly. And I originally was going to call the book Once We Win the Civil War. It's that what is possible. And I think two things are enormously, two things make it enormously possible to do big things. And so one is getting away from this notion of compromise with people who are trying to destroy you. And so much of our public policy we have is a result of some compromises, not what we actually fully want to see. So if we get out of this mindset that there are people of good faith on the other side and really just try to look at, now, what are we trying to do? So that's one piece. And then if they're not in good faith, to bring it all back to a law school conversation, can you have a contract with people who are not acting in good faith? And so the social contract, I would argue, is not valid as is because the opponents don't believe in it.
And what are the implications of that? What do you mean by that? What are the implications of that?
Well, we feel that the social contract means that you have an election and then the losing side accepts the election and there's a transfer of power and things move forward. They're all like, forget that. We're going to storm the Capitol and kill police and deny the election because we don't believe in this social contract. So if you are liberated from feeling like you have to reach an agreement in a contractual negotiation with another grouping of people who don't share the belief that nobody should be hungry. Everybody should have enough to, quality educate was King's thing, 3 meals a day for the body, education, culture for the spirit. It can liberate us to think about, well, what should the social contract be? Right? I was listening to this podcast, somebody was saying, maybe we shouldn't have Social Security at 65. Maybe we should have Social Security at birth. So then you actually free up people. It gets the concept of universal basic income. And so you free up people from being wage slaves or whatnot, so they're able to explore their own interests and their creative possibilities. And then we've been forced into thinking about some of this stuff through the pandemic. Do we need to all be going to offices, right? And do we need to have that level of pollution that comes from this and whatnot? So, and can and should the government subsidize all of these different businesses, which it actually is doing? So it's that type of unfettered imagination that becomes possible once we win in terms of getting the power, and once we're no longer constrained to the notion that we're bound by a social contract with people who don't actually adhere to the principles of it.
Okay. So one idea I hear there is universal basic income, that I take it you would class yourself as a supporter of
Absolutely.
universal basic income. Is there another discrete big idea like that you would like to see the Biden administration pursue?
Yeah, it was funny because in my first book, the publishers pushed me to say, think of some big ideas, some out of the box pieces. And I was all like, all right, there should be a wealth tax. That's my radical idea. And next thing I know, Elizabeth Warren's like 2% wealth tax, right?
That's because she read the book. That's right.
Right. But that remains you could end poverty with a wealth tax on the top 1% of people. And if you look at if you do a 2% wealth tax, if you look at the history of the stock market in this country, the average return is 10% a year, averaged out. So you're not even asking people to really give up. You're just saying get richer a little slower, and we could actually then end poverty. So right. That is and then I think Warren showed that there is popular appeal for that. So that I would say is another very specific idea. And I guess the other piece would be to tie back into the thing about the voting piece. The whole note, and you're supposed to be a democracy, which means you should want people to vote. And so are we going to get towards universal suffrage, universal on same-day voter registration approaches, right? I mean, you can use your credit card in any store in the country without all of those different hassles. They have a reasonable idea you are who you are. So why can't we just vote without all of this burdens and hassles that we have to go through? So that is something I think that we should actually, and I keep thinking about all these things people are passing in these states. Aren't they violations of the 15th Amendment? Isn't voting a fundamental right that there should be strict scrutiny applied to any of these different laws? And so then what can lawyers do to be able to put pressure on that realm of society as well?
Well, one of the challenges is that we don't actually have voting as an affirmative right? We have prohibitions on what the government can do, but we don't actually require the government to do much for people to have a good life. So you have three big ideas that I've heard. One is the universal basic income, the other is the wealth tax, and then the third would be to take seriously the idea that everyone should vote, and that we affirmatively want everyone to vote. And one of the questions that's latent there is the connection between those big ideas and racial injustice. And we could take one part of that would be the relation between economic injustice on one hand, racial injustice on the other. Sometimes people talk about those two as though they're separate, right? You have race-based affirmative action and you have class-based affirmative action. So they're two separate parallel issues, but I take it you think that they are intertwined in some deep way. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, and so well, just one thing to look at on the other issues is that one thing people should take a look at is the NAACP and Congressman Benny Thompson are suing Trump under the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is like an 1870s, 1880s law and whatnot. So I think this is an opportunity to find those types of creative approaches and bring a level of, frankly, audacity and boldness to the legal sphere, utilizing all of our tools to push back and on the things that they've been moving forward. So I would just kind of encourage everybody to think along those lines. Ultimately, we have to get to the question of reparations, right? And so we did on one of our podcasts, and I think July at the time when they were considering this bill, HR 40, which would create a commission. And I was trying to do a reimagining, again, to our age here, the show from the 60s, the Beverly Hillbillies, right? I was like, imagine if that they had discovered oil, but it's hard to create an oil drill and get the oil and make it valuable. So imagine they went to the next town, kidnapped people, brought them over and made them create the oil, make it wealthy. You can't imagine that it had all been on Native American land. And then that family made all this money, was all very wealthy, moved away to Beverly Hills, used all that money to become big figures in our society. And the other family, which had done the work, had never benefited from that wealth. And then imagine that the grandchildren met each other, and one's just a working person, the other's got this, family wealth. And they're like, well, you should be working hard. That's what the United States is. The wealth was created by Black people working in fields, picking cotton, which was then sold, which was a driver of the world's wealth, right? Empire of Cotton, the book really breaks that down. And I didn't realize I was writing my first book. We all think that Brown versus Board of Education ended the discrimination within this country. Only in education. It did not end discrimination in corporate America until 1964. So until 1964, it was perfectly legal to discriminate racially on who you hired, who you promoted, who got the jobs. Housing, the home my parents grew up in, that I grew up in, they would not sell it to my parents because they were Black. They had to get a white civil rights lawyer to buy it and then deed it over to them. So the modern manifestations of the racial wealth gap are a continuous unbroken line up until today. So we ultimately have to get at this issue of the racial wealth gap and the question of reparations and how that is all going to play together if we're really going to talk about equality within the society.
Wow, I wish we had more time, but we are at the end of our time. So I've been told that we need to end now. This is a great conversation that we will continue. Thank you so much for joining us. That is the end of this week's edition of Tuesday Race Talks. Everyone stay safe and be healthy.